I recorded a song for my fiancée for our wedding and came home in a great mood. When I opened the door, I smelled sweat and smoke. My fiancée ran out of the bedroom, disheveled, and said, "Oh, you're back already? It's early." I rushed inside and saw a man climbing out the window. He jumped before I could grab him, and the song took longer than I expected, but not in the way that drains you. It was one of those rare sessions where everything locked into place early. The melody settled naturally. The lyrics felt honest without trying to be poetic, and the vocal take landed clean. Ronan noticed it too. He did not say much, just nodded the way people do when they know something worked. I recorded that song for Lena, not as a surprise performance or some social media moment. It was meant for the wedding. One quiet thing in a loud day. Something that would exist even if everything else blurred together. I left the studio feeling light, already picturing how relieved I would be to finally cross that off the list. The session ended early. That should have been the first irregularity. I sent Lena a quick message telling her I was heading home sooner than planned. No response came back, but that was not unusual. She was often slow to reply in the afternoons. The drive back felt normal. Traffic was tolerable. I replayed the rough mix in my head, thinking about small adjustments. I even considered stopping for groceries, then decided against it because I wanted to show her the demo immediately. I wanted to see her reaction while it was still raw. When I opened the apartment door, the first thing that hit me was not sound or movement. It was smell. Sweat and smoke do not belong together in a clean apartment in the middle of the day. The windows were partially open, but not enough to clear the air. The smell was fresh, not stale, not something from the night before. It was recent and active. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me without thinking. The living room looked untouched. Shoes were lined up the way we kept them. The couch pillows were arranged neatly. The kitchen counter was clear. That made the smell worse, not better. It meant the disorder was contained somewhere else. Then Lena appeared. She came out of the bedroom too fast, like someone who had been standing just out of sight waiting for the right moment. Her hair was disheveled in a way that could not be explained by sleep. Her face was flushed. She was pulling her shirt down while walking, not adjusting it calmly, but scrambling to make it sit correctly. Her eyes widened when she saw me, not with relief, with calculation that failed immediately. She said something about me being back early. The words were wrong in tone and timing. She was trying to anchor herself to a version of reality that had already collapsed. I did not answer her. I did not slow down. I walked past her straight toward the bedroom. She reached for my arm and missed. Her hand brushed my sleeve, then dropped. She followed me, talking too fast, filling the space with noise meant to delay me by seconds. That told me everything I needed to know before I even reached the door. The bedroom window was open wider than usual. A man was halfway out of it. I saw his back first, then his legs. He was scrambling, not climbing carefully. He wore jeans that were half-buttoned and shoes without socks. One of his hands slipped on the frame as he tried to lower himself. Panic has a sound even when no one is speaking. It is in the movement. I lunged forward and grabbed for him, catching only fabric. The material tore in my hand as he dropped. He did not look back. He hit the ground awkwardly and took off running down the alley without hesitation, without checking for injury, without checking for witnesses. That told me he had practiced escape routes in his head before. I stood at the window for a moment longer than I should have, listening to footsteps fade. The city absorbed him quickly. By the time I leaned out to look, he was already gone. Behind me, Lena was breathing loudly. I turned around. The room told its own story without commentary. Rumpled sheets. An unfamiliar jacket on the chair. A glass with condensation rings on the nightstand. The ashtray we never used was out, holding fresh cigarette ends. This had not been a spontaneous mistake. It had logistics. I faced Lena. She started speaking immediately, stacking explanations before I asked a single question. Each sentence contradicted the one before it. She framed the situation as sudden, emotional, confusing, then harmless. She tried to redirect responsibility by accusing me of absence, of work obsession, of emotional distance. The order was wrong. She should have been apologizing first if this had been impulsive. Instead, she was justifying. I asked one thing. Not calmly, not loudly, just clearly. How long? She hesitated. That hesitation was longer than any answer could have been. That was when the shock finished settling into something heavier. Not rage. Not despair. Recognition. I was not discovering betrayal. I was discovering structure. I told her to stop talking. I told her I was leaving for the night. She followed me into the living room, still trying to negotiate control of the situation through volume and speed. She shifted tactics quickly, swinging between tears and anger when one failed to land. I packed a bag without rushing. Clothes, laptop, documents, the things that mattered. She tried to block the doorway at one point, not aggressively, but physically placing herself there as if her body could still influence outcomes. It could not. Before I left, I asked one more thing. Not his name. Not details. Something else. Did he know about the wedding? She said yes. That was enough. I walked out. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt final without being dramatic. In the hallway, my hands shook slightly. Not from fear. From the adrenaline dump after clarity arrives. I slept at Ronan's place that night. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. He saw it in my face and did not ask questions that would force me to narrate what I had already processed. Lying on his couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind did not replay the scene emotionally. It replayed it operationally. Timings. Access. Assumptions. Patterns I had accepted without scrutiny. She knew my schedule. She knew when sessions ran late. She knew when I would not be home. The man who jumped had not panicked because I existed. He panicked because he had been told exactly when I would not. That realization landed harder than the image of him climbing out the window. By morning, the wedding song did not feel wasted. It felt misdirected. And I already knew this was not going to end quietly. I did not go back to the apartment the next morning. That decision mattered more than it seemed at the time. If I had returned immediately, the story would have stayed small, emotional, and negotiable. Distance gave me clarity. It also forced Lena to sit alone with what she had triggered. I went to work instead. Routine is grounding when shock is still active. I showered at Ronan's place, changed clothes, and drove straight to my office. I did not open messages on the way. I already knew my phone would be full. I needed a few hours where my attention belonged to something that did not lie to me. By mid-morning, curiosity replaced anger. Not the kind that wants answers for closure, but the kind that wants to understand mechanics. Betrayal only feels chaotic when you assume it is emotional. When you look at it structurally, it becomes predictable. The man who jumped had not come empty-handed. Someone had let him in. Someone had told him when to arrive. Someone had given him confidence that escape would be possible. That meant timing. I pulled up my calendar. The studio session had been scheduled weeks in advance. It had always been planned as a late one. The only deviation was that it ended early. Lena had not accounted for that. Her reaction at the door confirmed it. She had been operating on a script. I opened my phone. 32 missed calls. Messages stacked on top of each other, shifting tone as minutes passed. The first few were attempts at normalcy, then panic, then accusation, then apology, then threats, then apologies again. She was cycling through leverage, trying to find something that still worked. I did not respond. Around noon, Ronan knocked on my office door and closed it behind him. He did not sit immediately. That told me he already knew enough to be careful. He said Lena had called him earlier that morning. That got my attention. She had asked him whether I had mentioned anything about the song during the session. Not how I was. Not when I would be back. Just whether I had said anything about her. That was not concern. That was damage control. Ronan told her nothing. He told me everything. I thanked him and asked him for one more thing. Not surveillance. Not favors. Just names. People who might have seen or heard something unusual around the apartment building the previous day. He gave me one. Mrs. Halvorsen from the third floor. She was retired. She watched everything. She had once knocked on our door because a delivery truck idled too long outside. People like that notice patterns. I drove back to the building in the early afternoon. I did not go upstairs. I waited near the side alley where the man had landed. There was a small cafe across the street. I ordered coffee and sat by the window. I did not stare. I observed. After 20 minutes, I saw Mrs. Halvorsen returning with groceries. I approached her calmly and introduced myself. I did not mention Lena. I did not mention the bedroom. I asked whether she had seen anything unusual yesterday afternoon. She did not hesitate. She described a man jumping from a window, landing badly, then running. She described his height, his build, his hair. She described the direction he went. She also mentioned something else. She had seen him enter the building earlier that day. Calmly, confidently. He had not looked like someone sneaking in. He had walked straight through the front door. That detail mattered. I thanked her and went back to my car. I already had enough. The man had not been a stranger. He had been a visitor. I drove to the address where Lena's car insurance paperwork listed emergency contacts. Not because I needed paperwork, but because it told me which social orbit she relied on when things went wrong. One name stood out. Caleb Reed. I had heard that name before. Always casually. Always framed as insignificant. An old friend. Someone from before we met. Someone who had supposedly faded out of her life years ago. People do not fade out cleanly without effort. I found him the same day. Not through stalking or digital obsession. Through predictability. People have routines when they think they are safe. Caleb worked at a mid-sized logistics firm on the edge of downtown. His car was parked in the same spot every afternoon. I waited until he came out. He froze when he saw me. Not because he recognized me immediately, but because my presence made something click in his head. He knew exactly why I was there. I told him my name. I told him where I lived. I told him I had seen him leave my bedroom window. He did not deny it. He tried to explain instead. We talked in the parking lot. Not shouting. Not posturing. Two men stripped of the illusion that someone else would absorb the consequences for them. Caleb admitted the relationship had not been accidental. Lena had reached out months earlier. She had framed me as emotionally unavailable but financially reliable. She had described our relationship as already over in every way except paperwork. She had said the wedding was something she felt pressured into completing, not something she wanted. He said she had rules. No messages when I was home. No calls after midnight. No social overlap. No visible marks. No scenes. Everything managed. He had believed her when she said I knew. He had believed her when she said I accepted it. He had believed her when she said I would never confront him. That was the most revealing part. She had made promises about my behavior. I asked him whether he knew about the song. He did not. That surprised him. He said she had never mentioned it. She had told him I was too busy to care about things like that. That was when the scale shifted. This was not a lapse. This was a narrative. I left him there without threats or warnings. He was already unraveling. The illusion that he had been chosen was collapsing. He was starting to realize he had been used as a placeholder, not a partner. That realization is heavier than anger. I went back to Ronan's place that evening and finally responded to Lena. I told her I had spoken to Caleb. That was all. Her reply came instantly. The typing bubbles appeared and disappeared repeatedly before a message finally arrived. She asked what he said. She asked what I believed. She asked whether I planned to ruin her life. I did not answer. Instead, I forwarded her a list. Vendors. Deposits. Dates. Times. I told her the wedding was canceled. I did not ask permission. I did not negotiate. I informed. Within an hour, the consequences started to propagate. Family members reached out. Friends asked what happened. She began telling her version of the story quickly, but inconsistencies crept in almost immediately. People asked questions she could not answer cleanly. The apartment became a problem too. The lease was in my name. Utilities were in my name. Internet. Parking. Storage unit. I did not threaten to cut anything off. I simply began the process of separation formally. Notices were sent. Access was scheduled to change. Timelines were established. Lena showed up at Ronan's place late that night. She did not knock. She rang the bell repeatedly until he opened the door and told her to leave. She cried in the hallway. She alternated between pleading and accusing me of cruelty. She claimed I was punishing her excessively for a single mistake. It was not a single mistake. It was a system. By the end of that night, she understood something important. I was not reacting emotionally anymore. I was acting structurally. And structure does not reverse itself because someone is sorry. When I lay down to sleep, I did not feel relief. I felt momentum. The man who jumped was no longer the focal point. Lena was. And she was running out of room. The apartment stopped being neutral territory once the paperwork began moving. That was the first thing Lena failed to anticipate. She assumed the relationship was the center of the conflict, that if emotions cooled, the rest could be negotiated. What she did not understand was that relationships end softly only when infrastructure is shared evenly. Ours was not. I had not designed it that way deliberately. It had simply evolved while I handled logistics, and she handled presence. That imbalance never mattered until trust disappeared. I returned to the apartment during the day while she was gone, not to search for evidence or dramatize the past, but to inventory what existed. Shared property becomes ambiguous fast after betrayal, and ambiguity benefits the person willing to lie longer. I photographed everything. Not the bed. Not the obvious. Documents. Equipment. Storage keys. Serial numbers. Contracts filed in drawers she never opened because they bored her. That was when I noticed something off. One of my external drives was missing. Not lost. Missing selectively. It was a drive I rarely accessed because it held archived sessions and used stems, reference mixes, and raw vocal recordings. Material that was valuable not because it was finished, but because it could be repurposed. That drive had been stored in a specific drawer in my desk. The drawer was now empty. I checked backups. The archive was incomplete. That changed everything. I called Ronan and asked whether Lena had ever been alone in the studio. He paused before answering. That pause told me the truth before his words did. She had. Not often. Not openly. But enough to matter. She had framed it as curiosity. Interest. Support. She wanted to understand what I did. She wanted to surprise me by learning the basics. Ronan had allowed it because nothing seemed suspicious at the time. People who are trusted rarely trigger alarms. I drove straight to the studio. Ronan unlocked the side office, and we went through access logs. Not security footage. Not timestamps. Just keycard entries and session bookings. Lena's name appeared more than it should have. Always tied to my absence. Always aligned with days when I was traveling or booked elsewhere. She had been using my professional environment as if it were an extension of our home. We cross-referenced file transfers. There it was. She had copied material. Not everything. Just enough to be useful. Vocal hooks. Chord progressions. Unreleased demos. Pieces that could be pitched to producers or sold quietly without attribution. Not theft in the dramatic sense. Extraction. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Ronan did not interrupt. He understood that this was no longer personal. It was procedural. This was not about revenge. This was about containment. I contacted a lawyer that afternoon. Not to sue immediately. To understand exposure. Intellectual property does not care about emotions. It cares about access and consent. Lena had neither. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. I had grounds to act. Quietly or loudly. My choice. That evening, Lena messaged me again. Her tone had shifted. She was no longer panicked. She was strategic. She proposed a conversation. Closure. Mutual respect. A clean break. She wanted to reset the frame. I agreed to meet her. Not because I believed her. Because I needed to see how much she knew. We met in a public place. Neutral. Busy enough to discourage theatrics. She arrived composed, dressed deliberately, performing stability. She talked about growth. Mistakes. Pressure. How she felt trapped by expectations. I let her talk. When she finished, I asked her one question. Where was my drive? Her expression changed immediately. Not shock. Not confusion. Recognition. She tried to explain it away as temporary borrowing. She claimed she planned to return it. She framed it as inspiration, not exploitation. She insisted she never intended harm. Intent did not matter. I told her I knew about the studio access. The file transfers. The pattern. That was when the mask finally cracked. She accused me of overreacting. Of leveraging power unfairly. Of trying to control her future. She said I was punishing her professionally because I could not handle rejection. The accusation was revealing. It meant she believed I was acting emotionally. That belief was her final miscalculation. I told her the lawyer would be contacting her. I told her to preserve all copies of my material. I told her to stop distributing anything immediately. She laughed. That laugh ended her remaining protection. Within 48 hours, the consequences accelerated beyond her control. A producer she had been quietly pitching to contacted me directly. He had recognized my sound in her submissions and wanted clarification before proceeding. That call did more damage than any legal letter could have. Her narrative collapsed publicly, but without spectacle. People simply stopped returning messages. Opportunities dried up. Doors closed politely. The apartment situation reached its next phase. Utilities were transferred. Access codes changed. Storage locks replaced. Lena arrived one afternoon to find her entry disabled. Not dramatically. Not maliciously. Just administratively. She left voicemails that time. Not messages. She wanted tone to carry what words no longer could. She accused me of cruelty. She accused me of betrayal. She accused me of destroying her life over pride. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded those voicemails to my lawyer. That night, Ronan told me something else. Weeks before, Lena had asked him whether I ever checked the studio's back-end systems. She had phrased it as curiosity again. She wanted to know how closely I monitored data. Whether I trusted automation. That was not curiosity. That was reconnaissance. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The affair had not been the center of her actions. It had been a tool. A distraction. Something emotional enough to absorb blame, while something more calculated happened in parallel. She had not underestimated my feelings. She had underestimated my attention. By the end of the week, formal notices were delivered. Cease and desist. Asset recovery. Breach documentation. Nothing theatrical. Nothing public-facing. Just pressure applied where it counted. Friends stopped asking me how I was doing. They started asking what had really happened. The story Lena told did not survive contact with documentation. She tried to counter it socially. She framed herself as creatively stifled. As a partner overshadowed by someone controlling. That narrative lasted until people noticed she could not explain what she had created independently. Talent leaves footprints. Borrowed access leaves gaps. The last time we spoke that week, she asked me whether I hated her. I told her no. Hatred requires emotional investment. I was simply done protecting her from consequences she had assumed would never reach her. When I went to sleep that night, it was not with anger. It was with certainty. She had lost control of the story, the resources, and the timeline. And what remained was about to become very public. By the time the formal notices reached Lena, the emotional phase of the breakup was already over. What followed was not dramatic. It was administrative. That distinction mattered, because administration leaves records. Records survive longer than anger. The first response from her lawyer arrived 3 days after the cease and desist letter. It was defensive in tone, but thin in substance. They acknowledged receipt. They denied intent. They requested clarification on scope. That told me everything. They were buying time. Time was no longer an asset she possessed. My lawyer responded within hours, attaching logs, access records, transfer timestamps, and a concise timeline. No commentary, no accusations, just documentation, the kind that does not need persuasion. The studio terminated her access the same day, not because I demanded it, but because they could no longer justify liability. Her name disappeared from internal systems quietly, without announcement. She showed up there anyway. Ronan told me later that she waited in the lobby for over an hour. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding. She claimed she had permission. When asked to provide proof, she could not. Security escorted her out politely, not roughly. That politeness hurt more than hostility would have. That incident traveled faster than gossip ever does. In creative circles, word spreads not through stories, but through absence. People simply stop appearing on calendars. Invitations stop arriving. Calls go unanswered. Lena's next move was financial. She tried to access joint accounts that no longer existed in practice. The funds had been separated legally days earlier. When transactions failed, she panicked. Not because she lacked money immediately, but because she realized how little control she actually had. She called my parents. That was a mistake. They had already been informed. Calmly, factually. They did not argue with her. They did not defend me theatrically. They listened, then told her the same thing I had. This was no longer emotional. It was procedural. She attempted to pivot socially again. She posted vague messages about betrayal, power imbalance, and exploitation. She never used my name. She did not have to. People knew. The problem was that her posts invited scrutiny rather than sympathy. Questions followed. Requests for clarification. Private messages asking for details she could not provide without contradicting herself. Meanwhile, the producer who had contacted me earlier withdrew formally from any discussions with her. He forwarded me their correspondence for transparency. He did not accuse her. He simply stated that the situation was unclear and therefore not worth risk. That sentence destroyed months of her planning. The drive surfaced a week later. Not returned personally. Mailed. No note. No explanation. Just the device in a padded envelope. The contents told their own story. Files had been renamed, organized, categorized. She had been preparing them for presentation. She had removed metadata in places, added it in others. She had not stolen impulsively. She had curated. My lawyer added that information to the record. At that point, settlement became her only viable option. Her lawyer reached out again, this time proposing cooperation. They offered to certify deletion of all copies, to provide a written acknowledgement of unauthorized access, to avoid further escalation. I agreed. Not because I wanted mercy, because finality requires cooperation. The agreement was signed within days. It included restrictions she would feel for years. Limitations on claims. Acknowledgement of breach. Conditions that would follow her quietly into future negotiations without announcing themselves. The wedding vendors refunded what they could. The rest was absorbed. No one fought it. They had seen situations like this before. Weddings end all the time. They only ask questions when the story changes midstream. The song never played. That detail mattered more than I expected. For weeks, the file sat untouched on my system. I did not listen to it. I did not delete it. It existed in suspension, like something waiting for context. Then I released it. Not as a wedding piece. Not as a dedication. As part of a small project about trust and misalignment. No backstory. No explanation. Just sound. People responded to it strongly. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt honest. The irony did not escape me. Something intended for a future that never existed found relevance only after that future collapsed. Lena moved out of the apartment under supervision. Not mine. The building's. She took what was hers. No more. No less. The process was quiet and tense. She did not look at me when we crossed paths briefly in the hallway. I did not speak. That was the last time I saw her. Caleb reached out once more, months later. Not to apologize. To explain. He said he had lost his job after rumors reached his workplace. He said Lena had blamed him publicly when things fell apart. He said he wanted me to know he never intended to hurt anyone. Intent did not change outcome. I did not respond. By the end of the year, our shared circle no longer existed. It had fractured along lines of credibility rather than loyalty. People had chosen distance over conflict. That was fine. I did not need witnesses. What mattered was stability. I moved apartments, changed routines, rebuilt systems, not to erase memory, but to prevent repetition. Trust, I learned, does not fail because of passion. It fails because of unchecked access. The final consequence arrived quietly. A mutual acquaintance told me Lena had taken a job unrelated to anything she once pursued. Stable, modest, necessary. She no longer spoke about creative ambitions publicly. She avoided spaces where her past associations could surface. That was not punishment. That was adaptation. As for me, the absence of chaos became noticeable. Not immediately. Gradually. Mornings were quieter. Decisions simpler. There were no parallel narratives to manage. The wedding date passed without ceremony. I did not mark it. Life continued in a way that felt earned rather than salvaged. Some people asked whether I regretted acting decisively, whether patience would have softened the outcome, whether forgiveness could have preserved something. They misunderstood the sequence. Forgiveness is only meaningful when truth arrives voluntarily. What I dealt with required containment. The man who jumped from my window disappeared from my life in seconds. The woman who let him in took much longer. But in the end, both exited the same way, without access.